In today's video, I'm going to talk about how Amazon scores your star answers against their 14 leadership principles, and more generally speaking about the behavioral interviews in general. So let's begin by defining what's a behavioral question, what's the goal of a behavioral interview. And the goal of it is to use your past experiences in order to predict your future performance. So whenever you're crafting such an answer, you should think of it in this context. More specifically, here is how a behavioral question is getting scored at pretty much any company, not just Amazon, with the specific note that at Amazon they also include their famous 14 leadership principles when using these scales. Now let's take it step by step and go through each of the main elements of it. So first we have the actual question, the behavioral question, and if you're subscribed to this channel, you'll know that I provide already a ton of such questions, even by position titles, and also a list with the 35 most commonly asked questions during Amazon interviews. So there's not much else to be said here. Now, when it comes to rating these questions, and they must use a scale to do a rating scale to do this, and this is what's called the behavioral anchorated scale, or the bars. Don't confuse it with the bar raiser. There's nothing in common between these two. How do these rating scales work? Well, actually, you could either make a rating scale of two possible options, either good or bad, with the risk here of being that many of your candidates being either good or either bad, so you won't get much choice after evaluating your answers. Or you could go with a more elaborated scale, like in my example, in order to understand more precisely what's going on with the candidate. And basically what each interviewer is doing, especially during the on-site interview, is to rate you on their scale for each behavioral question that they're asking you. Of course, each of pretty much any behavioral question during an Amazon interview is related with a leadership principle, and you should definitely keep this in mind, especially because the behavioral in the leadership principle is something you want to expose, to exhibit throughout your answers. This is pretty much the only way that you could ensure that you always score on the good side of that scale. Also very important to note here is Amazon is, as a large company, as any large company, has to put a lot of emphasis on working in teams, and working in teams means that you have to have interpersonal skills. So don't forget to emphasize on the fact that you're a great listener and you very much enjoy working with others, and to talk about the situations within a team context. Also interesting to say here about the scale is Amazon actually is constrained to use these scales. They know that these scales are not perfect. As you'd probably guess, it's not perfect to rate you with an analytic method on core competencies required for a role, but you must understand that this is their only options to do it, because they must do a panel interview. They cannot hire you based on one person's feedback. It doesn't work like this in a large corporation, especially the scale of Amazon. So they must use multiple interviewers. So each of those interviewers must have a standard to rate your questions on, and then afterwards they will gather and discuss the results of their hiring. Now, the last element of this scale is the notes section. The notes section is actually a lot more important than you think, because there the interviewer might add references of what they liked and what they did not particularly enjoy about you, also about their first impression about yourself during an interview, which, by the way, it is something relevant you should also be talking about. So how can you score points? How can you score better given what you know now, given the fact that you know that they will basically rank you against other candidates. But what you can do here is to really go through the 14 leadership principles and understand the behaviors there, to really prepare 2 stories for each of the 14 leadership principles, and keeping in mind keeping in mind the role that you're applying for. So in other words, if you go through your job description, I'm sure you'll find some pieces of advice, some clues when it comes to what leadership principles might click better than others. And of course, during the interview, probably you're not going to, not all positions, especially junior roles, not all leadership principles apply to for a junior role, but usually all leadership principles apply for more senior roles. So if you're applying for a junior role, you should definitely look at the core competencies and extract the leadership principles that are most relevant to your role, if you weren't already provided with them from your help from a main point of contact. And if you're a senior role, you could exactly do the same thing, and especially for senior roles, they provide some prep calls in which you could basically ask them this question. I mean, what are the most relevant principles and so on. From my experience has shown they are not very transparent about these things, but basically what happens there is that it's a behavioral interview, so you must understand that you must focus on your core competencies and understand and focus on your strengths, like with any great job interview. Now, what are some of the most common pitfalls when it comes to these behavioral answers and about the scoring? What impacts the most these scoring mechanisms? What are some of the examples of mistakes? The number one mistake is that I know of, especially for senior roles and for junior roles maybe too, is that you underestimate the amount of time it required to properly communicate these. So in other words, you spend 1 week to write those down, to think about them, to build the perfect strategy for it, and when you go in an interview, you feel like you cannot communicate them, right? So my advice to you would be to employ 50% of the time to prepare for the questions in theory, and the other 50% for the practice, role play. The second common pitfall is that many people are great at theorizing these things, but at answering things hypothetically, which again is not something you'd want to do in a behavioral interview. I mean, it's not a big mistake if you do it this way, but it's not the ideal way to do it. And for an application at a company such as Amazon, this could be a disqualifier, unfortunately. So whenever you go with an example, give a specific example. Like, for example, if they ask you, tell me about the time when you had a disagreement within your team, you should not go with an answer saying, whenever I have a disagreement in my team, I do this, these 3 things, which by the way could be perfect. You should always go with, oh yes, I remember a situation where I had a disagreement with another member of my team, and of course I did my best to listen, and I've called upon a meeting with them and we discussed, but usually I have an approach with these 3 things, right? So this is how you turn a hypothetical situation into a specific one, and I would definitely recommend you to do so, because this is something that not many people are able to do. And if you think about it, during a 5-hour interview, it's inevitable that you'll go too general at some point. So always keep in mind to be more specific. And finally, the last piece of advice on some common pitfall here is to not get lost into details. So be straightforward, be business-like. I mean, Amazon means business after all. So don't get lost in details. Of course, if you feel like an answer must take 5 minutes of their time, go ahead, say it, but just ensure to only mention the relevant details, and don't go in over explaining things that really don't matter, especially if you're interviewing with an HR person that has no technical acumen for that role. So there you go. This is how Amazon scores behavioral questions, and especially this is how they score answers. So I hope you found some interesting bits of information here, and as always, thank you very much for watching.